Iranians head to the polls tomorrow in an election that could have serious ramifications for the country's relations with the West. Hardliners are expected to defeat reformists led by incumbent President Hassan Rouhani after Washington withdrew from the landmark nuclear deal and imposed sanctions that have crippled the Iranian economy. A win for the hardliners is expected to see relations between Tehran and Washington deteriorate even further. This morning I spoke to Trita Parsi, founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. Trita Parsi, thank you for your time. Now, why has this year's election come to be dominated by so many hardline candidates?
Yes, I think it is quite likely that the political spectrum in Iran will not only move further to the right, but will be also much narrower than what it was before. Already we've seen a very large number of people being rejected from being able to stand in these elections. But perhaps more importantly, a lot of existing MPs, a record number of existing members of the parliament, were not allowed to run again, even though they wanted to. So we're seeing the political spectrum moving to the right and becoming more narrow. And this is undoubtedly a result, not only, but nevertheless, of the economic warfare campaign that Donald Trump has been pursuing after he breached the nuclear deal and decided to walk out of that. This is what was predicted at the time, and this is what we're seeing, that hardline elements in Iran would benefit from Trump's policies and that they would gain momentum inside of Iran. And Friday's election will be one of the indicators as to whether that ultimately has become the result of Trump's policies or not.
How do you think the assassination of Qasem Soleimani has impacted this election as well?
I don't think so. I don't think it will have the same impact at all. I think that the larger impact is the fact that the moderates, those who argue that there is value in pursuing diplomacy with the West, that there is value in striking a deal with the West, that there is value in trying to come to some sort of accommodation with the West, with the Iranians offering compromises, they have been proven wrong in the eyes of a lot of Iranians who have seen the economic situation in Iran collapse almost under these last couple of years, and the ironic situation in which Iran is under more sanctions now when it is actually abiding by a nuclear deal than it was before it signed it.
Are there any domestic factors influencing the Iranian economy, or is this just all down to the US?
No, there's plenty of domestic factors that are affecting it, such as the Iranian government's own mismanagement and corruption. But the mismanagement and the corruption has always been there. That has not led to a scenario in which the economy is contracting 9%. That has not led to a scenario in which Iran's oil exports have dwindled to less than 8% of what it used to be prior to sanctions. So while corruption, mismanagement is there, it's a major problem. It's a significant reason as to why the Iranian economy never fully lifts off. Nevertheless, the impact that we're seeing today is clearly as a result of the sanctions.
Are we expecting a lower voter turnout compared to the last election?
I think as the political spectrum becomes more narrow, which means that it becomes less representative, a likely outcome of that is that the voter turnout will be lower. Now, of course, these are parliamentary elections. Their voter turnout is always less than what it is when it comes to the presidential elections. But nevertheless, if it turns out to be much lower than it was in the previous parliamentary elections, then that in and of itself would be a headache that is mainly caused by the Iranian government itself, because by contracting the Iranian political space, making it more narrow, shifting it to the right, they're just leaving a significant amount of ordinary people out there who feel that they don't have any candidates on the ballot that in any way, shape, or form would be representing them.
If we do see the hardliners prevail, what does that mean for the US-Iran relationship?
Well, my fear is that if this means that this is a precursor of what will happen in next year's presidential elections, and that means that we end up having a hardline president of the country as well, then the most likely scenario is that Trump's hardline policy will beget a very hardline policy from the Iranians. And we may go back to a type of Ahmadinejad era president who will pursue a much, much more aggressive line towards the West. Again, something that could have been completely avoided had Donald Trump simply stuck to the nuclear deal. If he wanted to expand on it, he could do so without destroying it first. He chose to destroy it, and he has nothing to show for it except for the fact that it now appears more and more likely that the Iranians are going to become more problematic to the US than they were before.
And this will be a real problem for Donald Trump heading into the election.
Certainly, I think it lies in his interest that this doesn't escalate further towards a military confrontation. A lot of people in America and a lot of his own supporters are very skeptical and critical of the endless wars, and it would be difficult for them to accept that Donald Trump would have started another one. And what we've seen so far is that he himself does not seem to be in favor of another war, but he's nevertheless pursuing a policy that is putting the United States on the verge of war constantly. The US and Iran have twice in the last 7 months been less than 10 minutes away from a full-scale war. That is, again, a direct result of the economic warfare that he's been pursuing.
We know Donald Trump's had this approach of maximum pressure with Iran. Do you think that this election result could influence him to change his mind?
I'm not so confident that it would, because at the end of the day, I don't think he perceives it as being costly enough for him to need to shift it. But we should never say never. I think in a second term, perhaps he would either be more flexible or he would feel like he has even less constraints and become even more hawkish. It's extremely difficult to be able to predict how he will act. The one thing I think is clear, though, is as long as he surrounds himself with individuals that do counsel war and do counsel this maximum pressure strategy, then I find it very difficult to see that he would be able to break out of that and pursue his own independent path. When he has tried to do so on other issues, he has nevertheless oftentimes been forced to adjust his policies to the recommendations of his close advisors.
And of course, most importantly, what do you think this means for the Iranian people?
Well, I think, unfortunately, for the next years to come, this is going to be a tremendously difficult period for the Iranians, not just economically, but also now politically, because their prospects of being able to slowly but surely move the Iranian political system towards greater openness has now suffered a significant setback with Trump walking out of the nuclear deal, and it may suffer yet another setback if the parliament ends up in hardline hands after these elections. So the prospects for broader democracy in Iran, which of course Iran has been far from, but nevertheless it's an ongoing struggle, is looking more dim now than it did before.
Trita, Parsi, thank you for your time.